In this presentation, we're going to be exploring end-to-end testing using Playwright. I'm Jay. I'm a senior cloud advocate at Microsoft, and I am very active in the Python community. So I have to let you know that Playwright is a Microsoft product. However, everything that we're going to be doing, we're doing on our local machines. Everything is done absolutely free of charge. And the pieces that we are using by deploying to Azure can be hot swapped with whatever cloud provider you like to use, although we do hope that you'll use Azure. We are responsible for a space exploration site that runs on Flask, uses Postgres, and is deployed using Azure App Service. The site is relatively simple. There are a few destinations that we can go to, and of course, we can request more information if we'd like. Now, when we're going through the process of interacting with the website and ensuring that that website works, we have to think about a few things. Here's a look at each of the individual types of pages that we have. We have basic information, we have some information that's driven by databases, and then we also have information or pages where we will actually send data to our databases. We need to make sure that all of these are functional, but that they also interact with each other, which means by clicking one page link, I can go to another page link, and that all of these links operate the way that we would expect them to. Why does this graphic look familiar? Anyway, look at the individual website. We're kind of breaking it down into individual components, and this is where end-to-end testing looks a lot different than just our traditional PyTest or backend tests. We're concerned about the functionality, but we're also concerned about the several different components. We can visualize all of the different areas that are important to us and make sure that each of those areas have been addressed. Also then look at how these different spaces perform differently depending on what device you're using. On a laptop, visibility is a little bit less of a problem because your screen is basically unobstructed. But when you are looking at particular mobile devices, you actually have to take that into account, and it's important to highlight some of those areas where you'll have a problem. We could solve some of these problems by asking our pair programmers to help us with a hamburger menu. However, by doing so, are we actually solving the problem, or are we creating more? Now, if we added this hamburger menu that GitHub Copilot is going to create for us, it did get us about 80% of the way there. However, it didn't include some of the accessibility things that we need to do to make sure that we're in compliance with our accessibility standards. So this is where end-to-end testing comes in. End-to-end testing allows us to completely test via the front end all of the capabilities of our website. This means that we're able to test the user experience, accessibility, and whether or not the site functions as we expect it to, because we are actually testing the site's functionality. Now, the tool that we're going to be using for this is called Playwright. Playwright is an open source Microsoft product that does end-to-end testing all on your local device. It allows you to interact with a browser, the browser of your choice, with Chromium being the default. It also gives you access to really powerful tools that allow you to build tests quickly, but also interact with web pages as you're used to as a developer, which is really important. Sorry, I needed to get out of the way there. But when we are using Playwright, we're often going to be using kind of three different paradigms. It's like a 1, 2, 3 to Playwright testing. We're going to go to the page that we want, We're going to get by, which is either a role or text. And then we're going to expect against a result or a value that we would like to have. You'll see this pattern very often when we're writing our Playwright test throughout this talk. So this is what it looks like to install Playwright. It's a Python package, or at least PyTest Playwright is. Well, Playwright is also a package, but we often recommend that you just use PyTest Playwright. It's going to install the Playwright package, and then you're also going to want to install the dependencies that you need for testing your browsers. You can use Playwright install -- with deps, but I would encourage you to just install the dependencies for the browsers that you're actually going to test against. And for us, by default, that's just the Chromium browser. And you can do so by just passing in the Chromium flag before you're with deps. Now, let's look at creating tests. You can create your tests manually by just typing in the code required to do so. And you can also check the Playwright docs. They're relatively simple, and the syntax that you use is almost in a readable format. So you would say, again, go to, followed by the page that you're looking for, get by role, and that role can be a link, or it can be text, or it could be some value, and then whatever that role is. And then you could say, expect this page to have, or expect this object to have the necessary information. You could do all of that, don't get me wrong. Perhaps the best way to do this is to just use Playwright Code Gen, which we're going to take a look at right now. So we have our Flask application running, and now we want to start establishing some of our Playwright tests. We're going to do so by opening up a terminal window and making sure that we have Playwright installed. We're going to do Playwright Code Gen. This should open up two windows. It's going to open up a blank Chromium window and our Playwright inspector. Let's first look at the inspector. We can see that we are in record mode. Let's change our target to PyTest. And as you can see, you already have some of the sample code boilerplate that you might see in a traditional PyTest test. We've imported some of the modules that we'll need to run our test, and we've been given a starting point to test with. Now, if we turn over to our Chromium window that was opened, we can quickly get started by going to our demo site. I've set this at localhost 8000. I'm going to have both windows open with the Playwright inspector a little bit smaller, so you can see that as we start navigating through the page, we'll start seeing some of the individual components being generated. If we scroll down, we have our site. We have individual windows that we can see. And we can also see the individual components that these windows, or that these objects, point to. If we click on destinations, we see that the site has moved to destinations. Now, naturally, by default, we have our pick locator. That is, as we pick something, we can see it does our get by role, or get by whatever that object is. But we can also make some assertions. Like we can assert some text. So let's go to our first option here. Let's actually check on cruise destinations. We want to make sure that this element does contain the text cruise in it. So we update that, we press enter, and just like that, we have an updated test. We can also do things like assert visibility. So we can make sure that Bit, our mascot, is visible. And we can also assert certain values. And the nice thing is we can continue to create multiple tests over and over and over. We can add as many tests as we want. And then when we're done, we just copy, We go back to our tests and we can paste that in. Now, naturally, we might want to adjust some of these. And this gives us the perfect place to start building new tests. Now that we've written some tests with Playwright, we can actually then go and run those tests. Now you could just do python-m pytest. It will run and it'll run those Playwright tests, but we won't have visibility of what's happening. We can also do it in a headed mode and see those individual windows pop up and things move, but that doesn't really help us either after the fact. Instead, Playwright suggests using tracing to look at where errors have come up. Now you can set tracing to either on, off, which is the default, or retain on failure. Here I've done retain on failure, but in just a second we'll show you what it looks like when we test and have traces for all of our tests. Now that we actually have some tests built and we've added plenty more for our site, let's run these and see what happens. I'll call pytest. Looks like we have a bunch of tests running now. Everything's going well. Now, as you can see, Playwright tests themselves are a little bit slower than traditional tests, and that's because with each test, you're having to build a Chromium window, test your endpoint, and then gracefully shut those windows down. So just a reminder that Playwright tests will run a little bit slower, so you don't necessarily always need to so you probably shouldn't only rely on Playwright testing. We actually have looked at building some hooks that allow you to skip your Playwright test by default, unless you specifically call them or want to run everything. So it looks like we have 100% success on our tests. Way to go. But I want to actually see what some of these tests did. So we're going to run this one more time. And instead, we're going to turn tracing on. So we're going to say tracing on. We're going to run these tests again. So now that we know our tests have passed and we've enabled tracing, unfortunately, tracing doesn't work inside of a dev container because it needs to point to a physical endpoint, point inside of the system. We're going to go back into our terminal and we're going to examine that folder. So let's just do a quick examination. There's going to be a test results folder in here. And let's just go down 2 levels. And what we should see, we expand this a little bit, is each of these folders has a zip file inside of them. Let's check this trace using Playwright show trace. Then we can actually go in and we can find one of those tests and we're going to open that trace.zip file. It's running. And now you see that trace viewer that we saw a few slides ago. We can change to light mode here just for people so people can see. And we see all of the individual actions as they were called and how long it took for them to run. So this is also good if you feel like your tests maybe are running a little too slow. You can see what processes took the longest. This took a little less than a second to run. So I think we're good here. But we can see here we went to our home page. We went the get by role to the destinations page. We should see that the page itself actually changed. It did there. We check to see if it has the right title. So we check to see locator root. And then we also did get by text earth. That should be this object right here. And as you can see, we can actually go in here and we can interact with these individual units. This is an actual Chromium window. So we can see what the action is. We can see what the action was before, and we can see what the action is afterwards. So on our action, if we want to get to our Earth window, let's click on that. We see that we've selected it, which is great. And if we wanted to continue on, we can actually go in. We can't interact with these pages because remember, we're in a snapshot, so you only get what you've generated in that page. But we can go and we can inspect what is on the page. So we can see where our root is. We can kind of go in here. We see some of the different information, some of our fallback stuff. Let's see. How do we get to just this point? There we go. And again, it's like a Chromium DevTools window because it is a Chromium DevTools window. That means, if we want to do our Lighthouse report, we can actually do our Lighthouse report here. It can be loading. It's doing all the stuff that it wants to do. It's gathering information and computing a score. Ooh, maybe we do need to work on our performance a little bit. But we can start building off of where we are. It also gives us the ability to go in and check. And as you can see, maybe there's some errors here. This is probably a good place to start in fixing some of those errors and those performance errors. But this is the trace viewer. And the best part is all of this information is stored in that zip file. So you can save that information and report on it later, or you can generate multiple snapshots and check against, how things were performing at one point versus a different point. All locally on your machine, you controlling all of the data, everything being done local and no services required. And that's how you use the tracing functionality within Playwright. For more information on how to get more out of using the tracer, go to the resources on the screen. Next, let's talk about the accessibility of our site. Now, accessibility is super important regardless of if you or the majority of your users have to rely on assistive technology or not. Studies actually show that your site is easier to read, more performant, and an overall better experience if you have taken accessibility into account, even for those that don't require tools in order to view. But it is important to make sure that those folks that do rely on tools like screen readers, magnifiers, and other types of assistive technology can navigate your website effectively and via these tools. Now, Playwright out of the box doesn't have accessibility testing built in. However, the team at DQ Labs has a JavaScript plugin that you can inject into a website to test for accessibility errors. And my colleague Pamela Fox created a Python package that is called Axe Playwright Python that allows you to inject the core into your Playwright test. This means that you're able to establish your Playwright, go into your page, inject the Axe core tests in, and then record the results and save them for future testing. Let's take a look at what that looks like let's see what it looks like to test for accessibility using Playwright via Axe Playwright Python. So the first thing that you're going to need to do is you're going to need to import your Axe test, which is from Axe Playwright Python .sync Playwright. You're going to import Axe. This is going to be the embed that we add to, or this is going to be the logic for the embed that we add to our tests when they run. And what we've done is we've actually created a separate function that allows us to then test on all of our pages. So basically you just call this function at the bottom of your test after things have loaded. So it runs all the tests, and then before it shuts down or before it tears down, it then runs your accessibility testing. So let's take a look at how this works. First, we're going to run Axe run on the page, and that's just going to be the page that we're currently on in Playwright. Then we're going to check for violations. So if the violations count is more than 0, you could set that to 1, 2, 3, especially if you already know that you're going to have a couple of violations, or if you've run this before previously, you can raise that threshold. And then from there, you can begin to collect some of this information. Now, what we've done is we've actually created a path called accessibility results that we can go in and look at and see all of the errors that are generated. And that's what this results.generate report is. Now, we've already run this, so we should actually already have accessibility reports if there are any. Let's actually go to one of our templates, and we're actually going to introduce an accessibility error. Now, we're going to introduce a small one that we can quickly go back and fix. But I want to go in here, and we have this image that we're calling, and we have a nice alt tag for it. Let's remove that alt tag. So we're going to comment out this section. And just to make sure we're not cheating, we're going to remove any previous accessibility tests that may have existed. Okay, so now when we see this, we don't have accessibility tests here. So let's call our test again. Our tests are going to run. Oh, we see some failures. Now, what we do see, we have accessibility violations found, and we can see it's stored, and if we did the verbose one, it would have a longer error message there. But we look and we see that we do have accessibility results. So let's open up our accessibility results tab right here. And all of our tests, we can actually see what the error was. And we can say it found one violation. It was an image alt. So image elements have alternative text or role or none if it's or presentation. We can actually see more information if we want. We can click on this and open up DQ Labs's individual description page for this. It tells us what the impact to the user is, and it also tells us in what accessibility guidelines we violate. This is great when you are a company or a team working with government projects where sometimes accessibility testing is a requirement for compliance, but also it's just a good practice to have good accessibility. It also shows us how we can solve this issue. So we can do an alt, we can do an ARIA label, and we can also use our ARIA labeled by in case we have it being specified somewhere else. But we actually know what the problem is here. So let's just remove those comments. We'll save it. Let's rerun. And our tests are passing again. Great. Now you've seen how you can test for accessibility, but please don't stop at just testing it via Playwright. DQ Systems admits that you'll find on average about 57% of the issues that meet WCAG standards with their tool. That's clearly not enough. The best way to test for accessibility is to have the folks that rely on these tools test your website. That being said, this is a great start to solve many of the issues that you'll often run into just by quickly developing, and it'll get you much further down the road. So the last bit of testing we're going to do here is called smoke testing. This is when you want to make sure that you can quickly identify problems in your deployed environment. We're no longer testing our local environments. Now, this is because deployments are not trivial. In fact, sometimes you can have issues that are of no fault of your own that are preventing your site from operating as you would expect. But you can take advantage of some of the testing that you've already established to make sure that when there's smoke, you yell fire. So let's take a look at adding smoke tests to our deployed site. But let's take a look at what that looks like. So we've been testing everything on our local host. I've stopped that, and now we are on our deployed site. So this is our azure.websites.net. So you want to make sure, and then also just to ensure, we go to localhost 8000, there's nothing. So we're not there anymore. That's fine. So now that we've done that, let's go ahead and run our smoke tests. Now, what we've done is a little different. You could just rewrite different tests for your smoke tests, or you could just copy and paste the test that you want specifically for your smoke tests. But so what we've done for our smoke tests is we've created a default option that allows us to pass in a live server URL. This means that we can quickly say, I want to test against this live server. We've also moved all of this into smoke so that this doesn't apply when we are testing our local tests directly. The next thing that we did was we created our smoke tests, which means we have to specifically call said smoke tests. That means they don't run when we're running our other tests, which is fine because, again, that's for testing local. This is for testing our production site. And what we've done is we've actually just imported our local modules. But because we have our comp test running, our live server URL gets added, and we're able to reuse our existing tests that we want to use. Now, as you can see here, let's pull these up side by side. We're not testing everything. We're testing just the about. So that looks like just this, where we're going to the live server, we're getting by role, we're going to our locator, and then we're checking for violations. So we're doing all the stuff that we would do, but we're not doing nearly as much. I would say there is one thing that we're kind of doing that I am hesitant against, and that is we are injecting JavaScript into our live site. Luckily, we're not injecting data. We're just injecting the Axe core test to do our accessibility testing. So we're doing this for a few of our tests, and we can see these tests. We can go here. We can see it's that one, test destination. So we're basically just testing some of the endpoints that we have. We're not necessarily going all out and testing everything, and we're definitely not adding any information. The test request information one here is just making sure that we can get to the page with the normal user flow. So with that being said, let's test this. We're going to go python-m, pytest. We're going to go to the path, which is source test smoke, and we're going to call smoke test directly. And we're going to pass in that live server URL, which is that. Now we run our tests. And what we're doing is we're not testing localhost anymore. We're actually testing our live server. And we see that we actually did get one failure. I wonder what that failure is. Let's wait and see. Looks like we have an accessibility issue on our form. So it looks like, let's go and review that. And it looks like, insufficient color contrast on one of our buttons. Well, I think we can fix that. But as you can see, we didn't test on our local page, and we did find a violation that differed on our actual production website than it did our initial. In fact, let's double test this again by enabling tracing. So we can do tracing on. We're going to let that run. And then we're going to go back into our terminal and we're going to open up that trace. All right. So let's see. So we want to do Playwright show trace, and our test is going to be source test, smoke tests, and then we want to do the test that failed. So that's going to be test about our info request. And our trace file. Let's let that open. And we can actually see here that the URL that we went to, let's expand this, is our deployed site. So as we go on, we see it takes a little bit longer to load the page because we're in the cloud. We can also see how things are loading. And then we can see our page evaluation. And we can see our button here that has the contrast issue. Now, we could side by side this and see the difference, but ultimately we just need to darken the button. But as you can see, we were able to test across our actual website with this smoke test. Lastly, I want to highlight that Playwright isn't for testing all the things. As you've seen throughout this talk, Playwright tests are going to be slower than your traditional tests. Also, trying to test the functionality of what's happening on your database via Playwright and Playwright only isn't the best. And you also miss out on some of the other things that you're doing, like testing observability, sampling, as well as some of your reliability, security, and redundancy. You can do some of those things with Playwright tests. However, it is important to also have dedicated tests for those problems. That being said, if your job is to focus on your site's functionality, Playwright testing is a great way to get all of those bases covered and maybe a few extras on the side. Now, the last thing that I want to talk about are some of the next steps, and that is integrating your tests with tools like GitHub Actions. In fact, all of the things that we've talked about, some of the accessibility results and the tracing results, all of these things can actually be loaded as artifacts into your GitHub Action tests. So when you build your tests out and you deploy using CI/CD, you can run these tests and then take the results of them and have them stored in your GitHub Action. So this is great if you're submitting a PR and you want to just verify that even though all the tests passed, things operated as you expected them to, and maybe you didn't introduce any new errors that might get in the way of an optimal experience. So just to recap quickly, I want to bring up again that Playwright tests allow you to test your website or application end to end, from the front end to the back end. You're able to generate tests using Playwright Code Gen. You're able to review your tests as you normally would, and you're even able to extend on that review using tools like the Show Trace option. This allows you to test the functionality, your interface, as well as the accessibility of the site. And it is only one component of a comprehensive and more complete testing environment. But more and more developers are suggesting that you start with your Playwright tests, as that's going to be the experience that your end users have first, and then work your way down to the tests on the things that are happening behind the scenes. That being said, I've been Jay Miller, and thank you so much, and good luck testing your applications.